destroy some of those crops with similar kinds of chemicals, and that would make it more difficult for the National Liberation Front to engage. Now, as you can imagine, part of the challenge with that, of course, was how do you distinguish civilian crops from guerrilla crops, communist crops from non-communist crops? You couldn't do it, and so there were political ramifications that went along with this. So as they began to formulate this plan and how herbicides would be a part of it, they had a bunch of different herbicide combinations that, again, had been going back to World War II and developed by chemical companies in conjunction with the Department of Defense throughout the 1940s and 50s. And the two most common ingredients of these herbicides were these two commercially available herbicides. One was called 2,4-D, or dichlorophenoxyacetic acid. And that's an active ingredient. If you go to Menards today and get a bottle of Wheat Begone, you'll still find that the active ingredient in that herbicide that people use on their lawns and their driveways and things is 2,4-D. The other component that was widely available in herbicides at the time was called 2,4,5-T, or trichlorophenoxyacetic acid. And it's 2,4,5-T, which is really the culprit when we begin to learn more about the effects of Agent Orange and the herbicides that 2,4,5-T was in over time. So there were 6 different herbicide combinations that were used during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange was one of those 6. It's the most widely known, but there were several others, most of which also contained 2,4,5-T. And they were called, as some of you are probably aware, the rainbow herbicides. So there was Agent White, Agent Purple, Agent Pink, Agent Green, Agent Blue, and then Agent Orange. And they got their name for the barrels they were shipped in. It's not, as I always tell my students, because the herbicides that came out of the planes when they were sprayed were orange or white or green or purple. They all would have looked pretty much the same to people who were on the ground, like you were. But they were named for the orange stripes or the blue stripes or the white stripes that were placed on the barrels by the chemical companies who manufacture those in the United States. The overwhelming majority of the herbicides that were used in Vietnam, and about 20 million gallons from 1961 to 1971. So a lot, about 72 million liters or about 20 million gallons. 62% of that, I think, I'm working without the notes, 62% of that was Agent Orange. But a lot of the ones that were used early on in the war, 1961 to about 1965, things like Agent Purple, Pink, and Green, were very similar, almost identical combinations of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. So they had the same ingredients, particularly 2,4,5-T, that we learn later on causes some potentially long-term health problems. So even though Agent Orange wasn't actually introduced in Vietnam until 1965, after the Marines landed at Da Nang, the herbicides that were used in those early years of the war, if you or anyone you know was in the early years of the war from 61 to 65, a lot of those same herbicides that were sprayed across those areas would have also contained 2,4,5-T. So the overwhelming majority of the herbicides that were sprayed in South Vietnam were delivered aerially, some by helicopter, but mostly by the modified C-123 cargo planes that were used by the Air Force as part of Operation Ranch Hand, which really begins in earnest in 1962 and then continues until 1971. So what the Air Force did was they took these C-123s and they removed all the stuff from the back and they put in these really elaborate spray mechanisms that they spent a lot of time testing and building, especially down in places like Eglin Air Force Base down in Florida, trying to get the kind of system in the back that would allow you to spray these chemicals with just the right size droplet and just the right size breeze so that it wouldn't drift too much and that they would hit the primary target. So most of them were delivered by these C-123s, and if I had the photos here, I'd show you, and some of you probably remember this, these planes would come in really low and really slow, trying to get really close to those treetops so they could get as close to the canopy, especially in the really dense jungle areas, as they could. And of course, what that meant was that they were really good targets for enemy forces on the ground, right? If you're coming in low and slow, that's what they're going to be looking for. And in fact, the first Air Force casualty in Vietnam was a ranch hand pilot who was flying a herbicide mission. So a lot of it was sprayed through the C-123s. There were also helicopters used to spray Agent Orange and other herbicides. But the other one here, and if we can get it up, I'll show you a photo of it, which is in some ways one of the more interesting aspects, were the folks who were asked to defoliate in and around bases throughout Vietnam. And what we have in these situations is whether it was a large base like Bien Hoa or Da Nang, or whether it was a forward base, maybe a special forces base up in the Alloy Valley, we'd have these backpacks mounted mechanisms that's basically like a cross between a fire extinguisher and a leaf blower. It looks like one of those back-mounted leaf blowers. And grunts like yourself were asked to go out around the perimeter and spray down to try to defoliate and thin out the areas around the base to make it more difficult for the NLF to ambush. And if you can see the picture that I showed during this bar, you'd see that two guys who looked probably like yourselves did back then, 19, 20 years old, hot and sweaty from being out in the field, out in the muck for a long time, no shirt on, spraying the base and goofing off as 19 or 20-year-old boys will do.
We're trying to figure out, you brought a laptop?
Yeah, got a laptop here.
Do you have a cable?
I do have a cable. Yeah, so, sure.
We've got the screen now.
Okay. Sure.
Get it out.
Okay.
We'll hook up it.
Okay.
See if we can get it started for you.
Okay, great. Sir.
Question, and I know the answer, where did they store it?
They stored it at a variety of bases throughout the country,
Okinawa.
and including Okinawa. Yeah, it wasn't just in
It
Vietnam.
was over in Okinawa.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so if you can give me just a minute, we'll try to get the projector set up and I can show you some of these images we're talking about.